everyone. This is Nick with Tenacity.ai with my co-host Jason, and you're listening to the Cloud Cost Optimization Podcast. Today we're going to talk about a topic that comes up in many conversations that we have in the industry. I see this topic pop up quite a bit around how to solve the problem of shared costs. So Jason, I guess first, let's talk about sort of the problem with shared costs, especially when it comes to cloud spending and variable spending. This problem has persisted for a long time. Can you sort of, frame in your experience with how traditionally we have managed shared costs in the past?
Or lack of? I don't know that we've ever did it very well. I mean, it's a really difficult thing to do. I think one of the best examples is, I have an application that services many customers or business units, whatever the case may be. And, so I have all these different widgets. Each one is dedicated to a customer, but I have a central database that kind of manages all the data for that. So how do I allocate the costs of that one database instance across many different customers, right? And, with varying usage based on the customer, it can get really difficult to do it. So, I think the ways that we've done it in the past is you pick a percentage that makes sense and you run with it, right? That's how much am I going to allocate per customer? I think that's the way that we've done it in the past.
I think the problem in the past was actually identifying, what the actual infrastructure was, or what what the actual costs were that were underlying those shared costs, because you would go through a budgeting cycle and you'd say, all right, well, these various departments have these various budgets for their technology spending, but there's this bucket of stuff that is shared. And you give the example like a database server. And so you got maybe a capital expenditure, and it's kind of easy to conceive of, we split up a capital expenditure to out to those various budgets. Okay, so that's not too hard. I've got to buy a server. The problem is that it often didn't account for sort of the unidentified or hidden costs. What were the labor costs that were supposed to get divvied up? What were the networking costs or bandwidth costs that were supposed to get divvied up? What portion of the large storage array, or what portion of the network router, et cetera? And so a lot of times it just got ignored, or those things fell into just kind of a common bucket, period, and kind of spread almost like equally or not at all across everyone else. It just became a cost
equally across the entire department, almost the IT in reference to the IT department, not the organization itself, right? And not necessarily divvying up amongst customers. It was almost like considered base capital expenditures, like if I'm building a hotel, the air conditioning unit or something like that, right? Where it's like I've got like one air conditioning unit that feeds all these different rooms. So you treat it as a big capital cost on the whole building itself, and then somehow it would get divvied up equally amongst customers. Whether a customer took up a whole floor or just one room, it would get equally divvied up amongst them.
Well, and it would lead to problems of like really understanding unit costs. When you're looking at a product and you're trying to sell a product based on those costs that are associated to those departments and the revenue that they're generating, or maybe not department, line of business, the revenue that they're generating. If you're missing costs, then your unit costs aren't correct, right? And there can be some fairly significant cost underlying just the amortized capital expenditure that was sort of easy to take and divvy up, though even that can be a little bit shaky, because can you really predict your needs 3 to 5 years out? So that was kind of still just kind of a best guess. So it has kind of this impact where when you look at profitability of a product maybe that you're delivering in the market, sometimes you're not actually seeing the net come out what you predicted. And I think a lot of times that's due to missing a lot of these underlying costs of delivering the product.
Yeah, I completely
So agree. How to solve it, right? How do you solve it in the cloud world?
Well, the same problem still exists, except now you can actually pinpoint an exact operating cost for these different widgets, right? The other thing that you can do is the cloud. The best way to do it, if can be done, is each business unit, customer, whatever cost allocation group you have, gets their own set of infrastructure, right? That would be the easiest. And the cloud does give you the power to do that, right? I mean, even if you look at legacy relational database services, they have the ability. You have the ability in like AWS as an example to spin up an RDS instance on the fly for each individual customer. That's one way to solve it, is to just, because the power of the cloud, I no longer need one big thing. I can have many, many small things as opposed to having one big database. If you can't do that, I think you have to go the method in which you have to figure out what percentage you want to allocate to what different business groups of these shared resources, and go with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. In a perfect world, the approach would be, almost at a atomic level, be able to deploy those resources based on the product or the service being delivered. So you actually have unit costs are kind of isolated off for the unit being sold. And, there are some sort of practical realities of shared data and common data that can be difficult to divvy that up. And when you hit those instances where you can't get down to sort of that atomic level, the power in cloud is that you can actually see all those underlying costs. Mm-hmm. Maybe with the exception of labor, you're still going to figure out your labor costs. But when it comes down to infrastructure costs, I can actually see my data costs and my storage costs and my all of it. I can understand directly and exactly how much those costs are. So then comes the challenge of actually recognizing those shared costs across the different business units. That tends to be the difficulty. And I think that's the story we hear quite a bit inside of our customer base, is they're looking for elegant ways to recognize those shared costs across their environment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the one thing I think you have to really understand is if you can't have in unique resources by cost allocation group, it's going to be really difficult to get down to the dollar exact costs, right? If you have shared infrastructure, it will be very difficult to understand what customer A, as an example, used versus what customer B is, right? So I think one of the best ways to solve it is to have that. If not, the second best way is the way in which we're talking about right now, which is allocating those costs out. I just want to make that clear, because I think if you're just going to do shared allocation, which is better than not doing allocation at all, right? I mean, we would all agree with that. If I divvy up one database server 5% to each customer because it handles 20 customers, whether one customer is actually using 10% of it or not is kind of neither here nor there. At least they're being allocated some portion of those costs. But the best way to do it, in my opinion, is to have unique resources by cost allocation group, whatever that is, application, customer, whatever makes sense to the business.
When possible.
When possible. Well, of course. That is the.
Of course, it's the best way.
That's the ideal world scenario, right? I mean, if you can do something like that, that's the ideal world scenario. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's obvious places to do that. Not using server-based infrastructure where you can use serverless or container-based infrastructure. Much easier to divvy out your costs that way. Or recognize your costs. Containers can be a little bit obfuscated, but from a cost management perspective, but serverless, certainly you can directly relate. When it comes to the data world, it can be, or the storage world, it can sometimes be difficult because of those shared elements. When there's shared data or common data, you don't want to be storing, across 100 customers, 100 copies of that data.
Right.
You still want to you still want to share, you still want to use one copy of it. Just how are you going to actually divvy that up? And I think that the classic problem was that we had opinions of opinions, right? So we had some estimate of amortized capital costs and not really an understanding of all the underlying variable costs that went along with a shared set of services. And now we can actually get to what those actual costs are. So we have an opinion of a fact now. So we factually have those. We might have to divvy it up still. And there are a couple of strategies for doing that. I mean, one of the ways Tenacity does is allow you to tag around shared allocation, so you can actually divvy it up inside of the platform. But I'm sure that there are other techniques that folks use in order to divvy up those shared costs and actually see those allocations across their environment. Tagging is just a really easy way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, so I think we've probably covered off on that topic. Shared resources is one of those topics that just keeps cropping up in the conversations that we have, and I think that using a tagging based strategy in order to divvy up those costs where you can't go down to the unit or leverage ephemeral type resources in order to allocate resources directly to the customer, directly to whoever your bill back is. Take those remaining services and you can tag in such a way that you're actually going to be able to divide up those resources, or understand which resources should be divided up across the environment. I think what we see is that when you look at environments and you look at, well, where is there a struggle to actually do a chargeback or to do a bill back? Shared services are a big part of that. That's some not insignificant amount of the bill. Sometimes some customers it's 3 to 5% of their bill. Others it's in the ballpark of 15 or 20% of their costs are actually shared costs and allocated out. But what we do still see is even when they solve that problem, a lot of times there's still 30 to 40% of the environment that's actually untagged, unallocated, and they're trying to figure out where that should go.
So true.
That is maybe the real goal. Is you try and tackle what can I allocate out of the business units? What can I allocate out that's shared? So now I can tackle this bundle of cost that is something else. And that's where you want to be spending your time. Solve the shared services problem, or spend your time
completely
where stuff is not allocated.
Yeah. Start with making sure everything is allocated appropriately before you work on shared allocation. That's a great point.
Well, I mean, how many times have we run into in our past where 50% of a budget is just allocated out to everyone because they don't know where it goes? I've hit that in multiple organizations, both working for as well as consulting with and advising organizations where, the 40% of the costs they don't have allocated, so they just split them up. And, that includes all the waste and abandoned resources and stuff that nobody's using, projects that have been, that were a year ago that nobody cleaned up after. That sort of stuff is, or it's pre-bought unallocated space, which you don't need to do in the cloud world. It's about going and tackling that, and not sort of just assuming that's shared service space.
Yep, I agree.
Well, that wraps up our topic for today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the Cloud Cost Optimization Podcast. If you want to learn more about Tenacity, Jason or myself, head out to tenacity.ai. Check out our resources, free trial, free assessment of your environment, or reach out to us directly on LinkedIn or here on the show. I would love to have you as a guest, or have a conversation around your FinOps and cloud cost optimization stories, trials, issues, successes, etc. So thanks everyone for listening.